And now we are moving forward to our next presentation about sustainable AI and how it can be on the governance of a biased society. For this, I would like to invite Stefan Larsson, Senior Lecturer and Associate Professor in Technology and Social Change at Lund University. As well, before I move on with an introduction of our speaker, Stefan, I would like to remind you that you can be active and ask questions and maybe share your experiences, share your thoughts on our auditorium wall. If you have questions, I'll make my best to present them to the speakers, and let's have a discussion. So Stefan is a senior lecturer and associate professor in technology and social change in Sweden. He is a lawyer and social legal researcher that holds a PhD in sociology of law, as well as a PhD in spatial planning. His multidisciplinary research group focuses on issues of trust and transparency on digital, data-driven markets and the social-legal impact of autonomous and AI-driven technologies. His research domains span from consumer markets and digital platforms to healthcare and social robotics. He is an advisor for several Swedish authorities on the governance of AI and digital development. So welcome, Stefan. Are you here with us?
I am here. Thank you very much.
Hello,
Thank
Stefan.
you very much. That's a very nice presentation. Thank you. Hi.
I see there are autumn leaves in Sweden right behind you.
Yes, there are. Maybe the actual weather is not as nice as this virtual screen, but still, autumn. I wish I could go to Vilnius, but I'm sorry. Unfortunately not.
Well, we have the same, so you're not missing much. And before we go with your presentation, I have an interesting question for you. So now we see this world racing. Who will become the first in AI? Who will become the first and will have this flagmanship in sustainability? But as well, we are having this race of who will go to space first and will do many incredible explorations there. So are we having AI in the space zone?
I thought you would be asked, should we do this race? Yeah, we already probably have aspects of AI in space already. I mean, that sort of prediction tools, object identification, all of that stuff is very useful for many things. But I mean, following what I will present, I think the race to bring that back to it should probably, I think, framed as what's the sort of trustworthy AI, or like the the good value AI. That would be the race, I hope. Not just the sharpest tool, but the sort of the most aligned tool with societal needs. That's the race we should be in.
So we are all ears with you, and I hope after your presentation we'll get inspired of how to do so.
Yes, thank you. And as we heard, please put questions in the chat. I would love to pick some of that up. My take, you already heard, I do have a law degree, so I'm very sort of interested in the legal issues and the governance issues. But I also have a social science degree, and I am an associate professor in like the combination of technology and society. So my research team is very multidisciplinary. So my key sort of argument here would be like some issues of implemented technologies, particularly this data-driven AI technology, will have to be sort of studied in the intersection between different types of domain experts. So it's not just tech, it's not just law, it's not just social science, but the combination of it. So I want to bring up some aspects of that point, framing it as sustainable AI, but not as much as in environmental sustainability, but more like social sustainability, and talk about governance aspects, which is this track. Not so much explicit law, because we just heard some of the responsible terminology, which is really good to look at. And after me, you will see more on the explicit European Union proposal for an AI Act. That would be like more clear-cut legal ideas. I'm hoping to be the leap from what we just heard to what's coming next. And why study this in so many different domains? Well, I think that we can learn from some of the early adopters of automation, like the platforms, and see what challenges they have, met. And we see some of the similar sort of challenges also in healthcare, but also in the public sector. Different stakes, of course. I mean, there's a difference between, the emergency room choices and, the targeted ads, but still some similar challenges in terms of user trust or even professional trust in autonomous technologies. I will do this in five steps to be very clear then. First, sort of this fairness awareness, the awareness of that is not just about technologies and their sort of objective usefulness, but also that they interact and deal with many sort of fairness issues. Asking many questions on what is, like we just heard, what would be the responsible take on AI systems or autonomous technologies. This sort of awareness has been growing quite rapidly. So lots have happened the last 5 years. I'm just going to point briefly to that. And then I'm proposing number 2, more of a sort of theoretical take on, okay, how should we understand, or how could we understand this, societal dependency on this particular set of methodologies or technologies, because it's very data dependent, and that brings some challenges that I want to point to, talking about society in the loop. I'm going to clarify that in terms of, okay, talking about databases representing something. You will see, you see that issue also addressed in the proposal for an AI Act, maybe coming in the next talk, but still sort of the challenge I'm going to bring up is like, well, sometimes it's not just the representativity that's the challenge, because if you talk about fairness, sometimes it's society that brings sort of the unfair aspect. So society is biased in different ways, some of which harmful, some of which discriminatory. The challenge then would be, how do you deal with that when you train an autonomous technology on that? So I'm going to point to that more specifically. And it leads to some of the governance issues. And we've already seen some of that, and we'll see more of that after me. So I'm not going to expand too much on that, but point to a few main ideas on, accountability, transparency, and fairness, obviously, then. And hopefully give some advice. And I draw from some recent work from me and my research team on, you see some of the books and articles on governance and ethics guidelines and transparency aspects. So it's just go to a search engine and find it if you want it. Number 1 then, okay, what's the trend? This is some sort of trend depiction from me. If you compare this sort of awareness in AI and society today, it's highly sort of leaning towards the social sustainability. So the societal aspects, that's more on how communities interact with technologies, and less about environmental issues. Although those things are coming, because you can both use the tools to sort of deal with environmental issues, but also the tools themselves carry some environmental costs, like energy consumption. But I'd argue that the sort of first awareness would be on the social side, as opposed to like the traditional sustainability debate in the 1980s that's clearly focused on environmental issues. And you see this sort of, framed as ethics often, this sort of humanity values, ethical principles in reports like this one from the IEEE, which is very much like engineering based. You see it in how traditional AI conferences start to reframe parts of the conferences, asking for ethics and societal issues. You see it in how research funders, this one is funding one of my biggest projects, not only on the methodological, technical math aspects, but also humanities and society, which I think is necessary. And lastly, then on this section, many of the awareness ideas, like the normative sort of guidelines, have been on a very high level, sort of general level. And now I see, and many of us see a need that, okay, there are domain-specific needs that needs to be developed too. So, for example, you see the AI Now and the Ada Lovelace Institute report on the public sector specifically, because it's governed in a set of distinct ways, or like the health needs, like in the WHO sort of guidance. So new sort of reports goes into domains and develop these sort of fairness ideals in those domains. Okay, number 2. This is my attempt of doing some sort of one-slide theory, in a sense, pointing to that, no technology is existing in a vacuum. They are always depending on, societal needs, interacting, interplaying with society. And I would argue specifically so for something that's so data dependent, basically depending on how you record and sort of quantify societal structures or behaviors, like AI, contemporary AI systems. So that data actually represents us in many cases, which creates some sort of interesting interplay between, we evaluate these technologies based on a set of normative frameworks, often law. We will talk about like data protection or like a coming AI Act, but also ethics, which is more less sort of regulated, more ideal, principle-based, but also social norms, like what we informally think is right and wrong, which then brings expectations on these technologies. Do they do good things? Is it right or wrong? Is it fair? The problems this brings, though, is two that I point out in this sort of the work you see referenced below, that, this fairness concept is not aligned always. I mean, you will have competing regulations. You will have social norms in groups that also compete. So some communities think, this type of family, this type of nudity in social media is okay. Others think not. So you will have different types of normative frameworks in a sense, competing. That's a sort of a challenge. And secondly, which I'm going to, dig into after this more, is that also we become sort of the training data for the functionalities. And that's a way to create meaningful sort of tools, recommendation systems that works. But it also means that whatever we carry, whatever sort of unjust behavior, whatever discriminatory sort of stuff we have, which we do, will also be sort of informing the autonomous technologies. And those types of problems are particularly interesting, I think, and hard. All right. So that leads to the question, we collect data from people. It should be representative, but what does it represent? I'm going to pose two problems which has different types of solutions to them. That's why I post them as two different problems. Number one, biased data leading to low precision for some communities or some types of sort of applications. I'm going to clarify now. If you don't know about the ImageNet, look it up. It's been a very useful database of pre-tagged images with labels. So in this case, about 14 million images with, this is a ball, this is a bear, this is a chair, all of that. And it's been very useful in terms of training image recognition algorithms or like the model training on that database, because then you can train a computer basically to point in a new image. What's in this image? Well, it's a bear, it's a chair. However, then that works well for stuff that's not disputed or where there's no sort of competing values in it. So people would not disagree on what is a chair or a bear, but they have different opinions on what is, for example, a wedding dress or something else that's like a culturally embedded phenomenon. So when other studies looked at this database, they say, where do the images come from? Well, they tend to be from the US or from Europe. That means that they're likely not so good at representing non-US and non-sort of European objects like wedding dresses. So it means when you train functionality on that, it's really good at spotting the sort of classic US wedding dresses, but it's not so good at spotting North Indian bridal dresses, which then it would be classifying as costume or performance art, which is sort of could be offensive then, right? So they suggest, we need to be, assess this sort of biases, and we need to pay attention to this sort of the less accuracy for some sort of objects. And for dresses, it might not be as problematic, but when you look at Bulanwini and Gebru studies, then you could have female faces and, dark skin. If they have less precision, that's sort of discriminatory, right? Or if you put that into a traffic situation, you could have cars who are less good at detecting pedestrians who have dark skin or like a different skin tone than the most represented data. Then you higher the stakes and it's more of a problem. Sometimes you can solve this problem by adding more data to make it more representative of all of these sort of objects. So that would be one way. That would be like a computer scientific solution to that problem. The other problem here is of a different kind, I would argue, when you have biased social structures to train from. And I'm also looking at, this is becoming an old study, but I think it's interesting that when a team looked at like an automated ad system, sending, in this case, they looked for job ads. And they found that it was sort of, it was implementing a sort of a gender bias that more often conveyed well-paid jobs to men than women. And my interpretation of this is it was not designed to sort of be this sort of unjust. It was just learning from how the labor market is unjust or skewed. That creates a different type of problem then, right? Should you intervene with this recommendation system to try to sort of aspire for a more just labor market? And if so, what would be your benchmark? Well, in this case, it may be easier because you have like a binary approach, men and women in a sense. You could look at the salaries, but in many cases, that sort of normative benchmark would be hard to state, and it would be easily disputed. So the point being, it's not easily solved by. It's not that the data is not representative. It's probably the other way around. It's likely representative for a biased society. So that's a different type of problem then. It's not something you can easily optimize or have like very clear solutions to. You need other types of competences in that sort of group. And you see that also in other, I bring up one case would be the Tay, a chatbot that was in this sort of interaction with Twitter, with other people at Twitter. It became very quickly anti-feminist and sort of paid tribute to Hitler, which is sort of the worst quick transition you could picture. But the point being, it's in the interaction with humans that it sort of learned from that interaction, and then in sort of it ended up in a really sort of a harmful position. And you see also, if you bring back to the example of ImageNet, that it's not that tagging is neutral either, because it, in that case, and in many cases, depends on very much human labor, which is not necessarily seen. You don't see it when you use the database, but it's depending on humans looking at pictures saying, this is that, this is this. And when it comes to bears and balls and chairs, it might not be problematic. But when it comes to men, women, relationships, family structures, whatever that's culturally sort of embedded, then it becomes problematic and at least non-neutral. So in that case, then you could argue that whatever norms and values that you have in these sort of tagging humans, that will be reproduced in the database, which then would sort of be reproduced when you train a functionality on it. So that's a different type of problem then, right? Harder to deal with in the terms of representativity. So given these two sort of sets of challenges, I could look to main ideas of government then too. I'm not going to talk about the whole sort of, there's been a wave of ethics guidelines, and I'm just pointing briefly to the European sort of development of ethics guidelines. And issue mainly like the blue one on ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. And later in the next talk, you'll talk about the proposal for an AI Act. So the AI Act is depending on this development, right? And what has this development then sort of contained? Well, partly this sort of ideas on trustworthy AI, to realize the trustworthy AI. The high-level expert group appointed by the European Commission said that, well, It has to be accountable. We need to deal with accountability. Who's to hold accountable for a system? You can't just leave it alone. Should have human agency and oversight, which is sort of interrelated. Technological robustness. Well, it's kind of expected, right? It should work. It should not be easily sort of broken or glitching. Privacy and data governance. Well, we just had Ashley mentioning that too, which is sort of clear. But on the other hand, that's not only ethical thing. It's also part of clear regulatory already present legal aspects. Transparency, which I think is particularly interesting, because it's not so easy to say what would be meant. Would it be like the user agreements? Would it be the sort of explainability of the model construction, or is it more the literacy? Should you train these sort of the patients or like citizens? And then you have, of course, non-discrimination and then a wider category of societal and environmental well-being. But I think I should focus on my last slide before summing up on the middle thing, that the continuous assessment. So lastly, then, the continuous assessment is easier said than done. You see it in the AI Act proposal, for example. It's not really stated to the extent I can understand how often that would mean. I mean, some sort of repetition and some sort of revisit of the assessment. But the proposal at least says conformity assessment. So you should at least focus on assessment. So, and there's a whole range of literature on that. And you also saw that sort of responsible AI having lots of good ideas on, peer review, maybe stakeholder involvement and stuff like that. And in Sweden, we have a research institute called AI Sustainability Center. They developed this risk assessment with an ethical lens, which I think is a good sort of way to go. And this is still hanging in the air in a sense. What sort of tools, what sort of methodologies do we need to develop in order to be able to utilize the good stuff, the promises of implemented AI systems, especially those carrying higher risks. So you're maybe, we don't have to talk about the weapons industry or like autonomous defense systems, but you could just go down to like the public sector. If it's welfare distribution, it could mean a lot to that person who gets welfare or not. So that sort of assessment of what that autonomous tool does is key to be able to implement such a system. So I think that the step we're in now, moving from this sort of principle formative period, finding out what sort of ideals we should live by, now stepping into sort of, okay, when we implement stuff that are autonomous, that may be scalable, that may be less sort of involved in human decision making, but more like autonomous computerized decision making, then we need to develop this assessment methodologies much more. I think that's the step I see at this moment. We see some reports from, for example, AI now on algorithmic impact assessment, placing much sort of emphasis on transparency, documentation, maybe algorithmic registries, which is also part of the AI Act proposal, or peer review or like stakeholder engagement. Okay, do you ask people if you implement it in a smart city or something like that? You should probably also look through the eyes of the stakeholders. And then lastly, there are some papers from friends in Oxford, Jakob Mukander and Luciano Foridi, and those who published a bunch of papers on ethics-based auditing, sometimes around the terminology of socio-technical systems, actually pointing to this. It's not just technology, it's also organizations and humans in it. So we should probably have that grand perspective. So the auditing, I think, is the assessment methodologies is the step now being developed and needs to be developed. So summing this up in a few minutes, wrapping up the sustainable AI, sort of pointing to the social side of sustainability, but maybe also acknowledging these, of course, the financial or economics aspects of it, but also the sort of environmental things. You remember the high-level expert who pointed to societal and environmental well-being, which I think I think needs to be stressed more. We need to look more into what these sort of methodologies and technologies not only can do to improve environmental concerns, but also what sort of energy use, what sort of data infrastructures do they, what follows with them, and can we think in more sort of environmentally sustainable when developing these tools? Do the training has to use that much energy? Those types of questions needs to be stressed too. So 5 sums in that sort of frame would be, like I just argued, we move from sort of the principal take, and there's a whole range of papers I've written, at least one of them, on sort of, okay, this surge of ethics guidelines in different levels, both in, governmental, pan-European, but companies and NGOs. Okay, what principles should we abide by? And how do you move now from sort of this level to implementation or scrutiny or sort of practical use? What sort of methodologies or assessments need to be done for that? And also look for stuff. What shouldn't we do? What shouldn't we allow is, of course, part of that. I think transparency aspects, but that's for another talk still. But transparency is one of the key things, I think. Whether it be like literacy for the end user or like registries, keep track of it, documentation, or like explainability. Can we develop AI systems that are more sort of understandable, less black box dependent, and more sort of, so you can scrutinize whatever functionality has been developed. Those types will be key here. So I think transparency also plays a key role for the trustworthiness of AI systems. Well, number 2 would be, scrutiny also includes unintended consequences. I think that sometimes even the lawmaker forgets that also the law creates unintended effects. I think that is one of the key things, which also then I think has to involve diverse teams. It's not only the ones who can code and develop the sort of systems, but also those who can look for injustices or cultural aspects or legal sort of aspects when scrutinizing the unintended effects. So I'm already arguing for this multidisciplinary needs, and especially maybe also in research about it. And also moving from this high level, I see many documents on this high level. That means that public sector in different, in different parts of private sector, different parts of public sector, all of these sector and domains need to translate this high level documents into sort of this context. That's why I say contextualize, situate. It has sort of specific needs each domain. So that's also a step being taken now. And lastly, then remember this society in the loop. Be ready for non-neutrality, because sometimes the tech debates can be a little bit sort of assuming that you can solve the problem easily, optimize it in a sense. But when it comes to societal structures, you could use that sort of old quote saying, well, technology is neither good or bad, nor is it neutral. It does things, right? So I like the question, is it fair to reproduce unfairness? Well, probably not, but that's a tricky question. What should you replace it with? And that's a different type of competence that needs to be included in these types of implemented AI systems. All right. Thank you.
So thank you, Stefan, for your presentation. And earlier today, we've heard that most probably each company in the future is going to be AI company. And as now most of the companies are working on their social development goals and where they are going to be by 2030 or by 2050, so many things can change by then, seeing how the technology evolves and how we adapt it. So what would you advise for the companies that are not currently or rented on AI? They are not working on such products or solutions, but most definitely they are going in the future.
Well, the advice, I think that AI, contemporary AI, there's been many visions of AI since the 1950s. Not all of those visions have been implemented. So today we're more leaning on the sort of information-driven, data-dependent, which means machine learning. That means that anyone dealing with lots of information will sort of sort of have to move, or they will be likely to utilize many of the machine learning capabilities. But my advice here would be there are probably lower hanging fruit in terms of complex problems. So stuff that's not so complex, stuff that's not so sensitive, go for those sort of problem solutions first, but also be ready for when it comes to personal data, cultural artifacts that are reproduced, societal sort of struggles that's been around for a long time. If you deal with that type of information, then you need to have also more diverse teams. You can't just put same types of group of coders to solve that problem when it deals with cultures, gender, sexuality, families. Then you're sort of bound to clash or have problems, I guess. So low-hanging fruit first, diverse teams if you deal with personal data in sensitive arenas.
But here I would ask, if we are grasping those low-hanging fruits, aren't we missing the big picture? As usually we would just keep, getting what is easier and trying to solve the easiest problem first. But in the long term, what strategy should be applied so that we actually see it as a bigger concept, as a bigger strategy for actually reaching certain results by 2030?
Well, sure. I think maybe we could come back to the race framing, the race metaphor. You posted very early that race. What are we racing for, right? Are we racing for having sharp tools, like the sharpest hammer, the biggest hammer? Or are we racing for like the most functional society that includes as many as possible in a good way, right? We are racing probably for some more of a qualitative essence. It's not necessarily the best prediction in facial recognition. It's more like, okay, what's the benefits of these tools? So I think that any goal should be looking for more of these societal values more than the narrow tech development. So grander goals for communities, for societies, and then you place technology development under it as opposed to the other way around, which is sometimes the discourse.
Okay, so thank you, Stefan, for your insights and for spending this lovely afternoon together with us.